Okay, great. Wonderful. Hi everyone. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome. Hi. Good to see everybody. Lots of familiar and new faces. And welcome to our Lha Bab Duchen celebration this evening. So my name is Alison Melnick Dyer, and I'm talking to you today from Lewiston, Maine, which is situated on the stolen and unceded homelands of the Amoskegon people. And I am wearing my hat of being a lay Sangha community member associated with Vajra Dakini nunnery in Falmouth, Maine. And I'm here tonight with Khenmo Drolma and Vanessa Sasson, and we're going to be having a conversation about Yasodhara and the Buddha. So Khenmo Drolma, for those of you who don't know her, she is the abbess of Vajra Dakini nunnery and the brains behind this celebration that we do once a year. Vanessa Sasson is a scholar of Buddhist studies, and she teaches at Marianopolis College. And she's a scholar, she's a Buddhist studies scholar, and she's the author of several academic books, as well as a novel called Yasodhara and The Buddha. So thank you both for coming and being here tonight. Before we start talking about Yasodhara and the Buddha, I wanted to ask Khenmo, could you tell us a little bit about Lha Bab Duchen and why it's important in the Tibetan calendar, and why is tonight different from all other nights?
It's a very interesting holiday. Traditionally, we have four major holidays: Buddha's birth, his enlightenment and death, the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, and then this very unusual holiday that we call descent from Tushi to heaven, or Lhabab Duchen. And in the Tibetan tradition, they think of it as Buddha was teaching in the God realms. He was teaching his mother, and he was there for 3 months, and the human community wanted him to return so that they could be released from suffering. And so there's this wonderful celebration of when he descended from Tushi to heaven and returned to teach in Sharvasti. And every time I looked at this holiday, I thought, but that's not the point. The point was he went to teach his mother. His mother died in childbirth. She couldn't benefit from his great wisdom in this life, and he didn't abandon her. And my sense was, the more I thought about the Buddha story, is it's a family story. It's not a hero's journey, it's a family story. So that's why we have sort of hijacked the holiday to be Buddha's Mother's Day and to have these wonderful events on Lhabab Duchen.
Excellent. Thank you for telling us a little bit more. I'm also curious, Khenmo. So in the past few weeks, we've been talking in our community. We've been talking about Yasodhara, the wife of the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, and the role that she plays in the story of his life and his enlightenment. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of these different stories of her life, or stories of his life, and how she shows up in that.
Well, this is why I'm so interested in this conversation this evening with you, Vanessa, because as you wrote, there are many different stories. And as people who are not scholars, there's certainly the story that went into the canon and was repeated, when I was first learning Buddhism. But if you go to any of the temples in Thailand, you see the walls painted with the life of the Buddha, and there is Yasodhara and all her attendants, and they're like sprawled and drooling, and essentially the story is that Buddha left because he realized, she wasn't as gorgeous as he thought she was, and that, you know, he should leave the company of women. So there are stories like that that are, really harmful and hurtful in this day and age. But it's a common understanding in the Buddhist world. And then I remember a wonderful Thai nun, really one of the heroic nuns, Venerable Dhammananda, and I heard her tell the story from the perspective of an aristocratic Thai family, of Buddha leaving, and the interesting choice that she made, certainly, leaving to benefit all beings to become enlightenment, but the choice she made and how she told the story was that when he returned, she demanded that he come greet her, to show her respect after she had been left and abandoned, and she demanded something that the whole culture would recognize as respect, not just a normal part of the crowd. And I think we all have enjoyed Thich Nhat Hanh's telling of the story, and he's certainly a trusted source. We know that he didn't make up a story, that he was using other fragments and other records where they came in as bodhisattva partners. They agreed before they took life that she would help him and assist him. And so that is one I can relate to. And then there's some unusual tellings that her pregnancy with Rahula lasted the same number of years that Buddha was searching for enlightenment, and that she went on her own journey during, in the castle. And then, of course, what is really heartening is then she and his aunt, as nuns, became enlightened. So they weren't in any way abandoned either. So there's this whole range, and we're very interested in your choices, and what you think about the different sources.
Wow. Well, that was a great overview. That was amazing. Do you want to start from there, or did you want to continue talking about, I agree, this is it's such an auspicious time to be talking about it and to be thinking about the stories of the women in the Buddha's life. And Yasodhara is one, but certainly his mother is another. And there's a question of, and Gautami also. But I think there's a real question of, there's almost this like kind of tug of war that I think is sometimes happening in Buddhist literature between pushing women away and then kind of drawing them back in. So I think if we just think about this moment, tonight of, Tushita heaven and the Buddha's mother, who is kind of pushed away by the authors, right? She's kind of killed off by the storytellers, and she dies 7 days after she gives birth. So there's a sense almost of like, we don't need her in the story anymore. So now you've played your part, you've given birth. Thank you very much. You can, go backstage now. And then there's this extraordinary thing of honoring the fact that the Buddha went back to find her, right? And that this is a festival that's on a par with the other major festivals in the tradition. So there's this sense of like a tug of war almost, I think. So same with, I feel like we're kind of jumping ahead with all these references. So it might be good to just go through the story. But just to kind of, I'm reacting, my mind's kind of like excited as I'm listening to you talk of this sense of pushing the women away, but then bringing them back, right? And so abandoning her, but then also finding a way in which she has that self-respect to say, no, he needs to come and see me. Right? There's this back and forth all the time, I think, in the literature. So the idea that the women are sprawled and he's disgusted with them, but then also this kind of extraordinary dignity that some of the women have in the stories. So I don't think it's one picture. I think the tradition's kind of wrestling with women all the time, and it's not like a one-shot deal. And I think that we see that a lot with the Yasodhara stories that we get.
So for the benefit of all the people who've gathered here, why don't you give an overview of how you're telling the story and why you made the key choices that you made?
Sure. So I'm just curious, does everybody know her story? Or maybe I'll just kind of give a total overview of the narrative. I think that might be helpful. I know that even if a lot of people in this community, I only see a small bar of you, so I'm really sorry I can see only a few faces. So I don't know if you guys are agreeing or disagreeing. It's kind of the disadvantage of Zoom. But I'm totally comfortable. I don't know if you guys are, if you want to just raise your hand or jump in if you have a question part way to keep things spontaneous. You're totally welcome to from my end. We should have actually discussed whether we agreed with that as a general policy, but I'm going to go ahead with that. So I'm not quite sure how much you guys know of her story, but even if you are all Dharma practitioners, I am, constantly encountering community members, and this is true here. And also when I give talks in Asia, of people who spend their entire lives surrounded by Buddhism and Buddhist stories and still really don't know very much about her. So there's no kind of embarrassment about that. She really doesn't get much press. And this is true, I think, culturally within kind of old school traditional Buddhist communities as much as it is in contemporary Western communities. So it's often helpful to kind of go through the story so that we're all on the same page, yeah? So one of the reasons why I think we don't always tell her story is partly because I think she's a bit of a distraction to the Buddha's life story, and I think she complexifies it. So it makes everything more complicated that she's there. It's also kind of hard to keep track of Buddhist storytelling because, and this is a little bit like what Venerable was saying at the beginning, there's so many stories. And so I think often I've encountered this a lot with different communities that I've spoken to, is that there's a sense of kind of bewilderment. Like, I don't even know what text we're talking about. I don't know where the texts are. I don't know where they fit, right? There's no Bible in Buddhism. And I think that's its richness, but it also makes it really hard to follow. And so we don't always quite know what everybody's talking about. And so if you ever do get that feeling that you don't know what everybody's talking about and you don't know which text fits where, you're in very good company, because most people don't. And it kind of takes a lifetime of scholarship to start to understand how this whole complicated system works. Yeah. And so it's hard to also keep track. What does it even mean that there's multiple versions, right? Multiple stories, multiple tellings of these stories, like which one's the right one? That's also really, I think, compelling question to ask when we're so used to having a kind of fixed version of our stories. It's not how Buddhism operates. And so all of that complexity makes everything really confusing and so fluid that sometimes we're just like, I just don't get it. So just kind of give me a summary and I'll live with that. And that might be easier to live with. But if you can get past the summary and start digging into the actual texts and all of their complexity, it's actually exciting. And there's so many rich, beautiful stories to enjoy. You just have to kind of let go and let yourself kind of swim in this vast sea of literature that doesn't always work together and contradicts itself all the time. And it's almost like a chorus of all these different voices singing the same story, but each with their own tenor and each with their own style of singing, and so you just have to kind of play in the stories. So the way that I dealt with the story of Yasodhara is I had a couple of things. I've always wanted to tell her story. I've always been really troubled by her story. I tend to gravitate to stories that bother me. And this story really bothers me. It upsets me, is the fact that he left her. I don't know if you guys are on the same page with me, but the fact that he leaves her, and that according to some traditions, he leaves her the day she gives birth to their son. And then he doesn't just leave her the day she gives birth to their son. He leaves without saying goodbye while she's asleep. That's one tradition. And so that version of the story has always been very, it has always upset me tremendously. And I've always thought I wrote this book in a way to try to spend time with this story to see if I could figure out a way through it, because it upset me so much. So to just give you, I'm doing it again. I'm writing another book, another novel, and this time it's The Request for Ordination, because there's another one that has upset me so much that I have to sit with it and scratch my head and try to tell the story until I can make the story work in my head. So I think that's a little bit of what I was trying to do with this. So I sat with the literature for a long time. I've been reading this literature for 20 years. And then I came across two things that I thought really kind of changed how I was going to think about this story. And so the first is, I'm assuming you guys know about Jataka stories. These are stories, I'll write it in the chat in case anybody doesn't know these terms. Oh, there we go. Somebody wrote, okay, perfect. So Jatakas is a huge body of literature, right? Because Buddhists do everything in multiples. So there's like thousands of these. There's so many of these stories, hundreds and hundreds just in one collection, to give you a sense. And these are stories of the Buddha in his past lives, right? And so the tradition is that when he achieves awakening, one of the first things that he does is he kind of, in a glimpse, remembers this long journey that he's been on for thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And the literature gets bigger and bigger as you go. And so then they go from hundreds of lifetimes to thousands of lifetimes to suddenly he's remembering 100,000 past lives in the blink of an eye. And so he sees his whole journey. He sees the whole story from these thousands of lifetimes of the moment when he first thought, I want to try to become a Buddha. And then every lifetime afterwards where he's just trying to figure it out, right? And he goes through all kinds of adventures, and he's a mouse, and he's a peacock, and he's a monkey, and he's a robber, and he's a thief, right? Like, and he's like a almost murderer, depending on the text that you read. And he lives as a tree spirit. Like, he has every life experience, with the exception of being a woman. Little like moments of patriarchy that just kind of pop right in there that I have to make reference to. That also upsets me. So he can be a mouse, but he can't be a woman, because that's just a bit too much for us. But he goes through all of these life experiences, right? And so you can read them, and they're fascinating. And a lot of them are like fables, and they're great stories, and they're adventure stories. And, you know, kids learn these in Sunday school kind of thing. They're great stories. They're painted on walls. They're just fabulous, good stories, especially because he's not perfect. Right? Because he's a work in progress. So he's still, you can criticize him. He can screw up. He can make decisions that you go, are you serious? Did you really do that? And you're allowed to have that relationship with him because he's not the Buddha yet. So it gives Buddhists some space to have a different kind of relationship with this character, right? Now, what's really neat is that if you pay attention to the Jatakas, you will find that it's always orchestrated. There's always like a frame around it. So the way every Jataka story works is that the Buddha will be talking to his monks, and the monks will ask him a question, and he will say, actually, that reminds me of a past life story. Let me tell you a story. And then he teaches the story. And then at the end of the story, he tells you who everybody was. This is really important to the Jataka story. So he tells you the crocodile was my father, and the mother crocodile was my mother, and I was the son crocodile, right? And he identifies all these characters. What this tells us is that all these characters in his life, his mother, his father, his son, Devadatta, who's always bothering him, all these characters were with him lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. That it's almost as though the family moves like a collective. Right? That these relationships are webs, and they're moving together through their lifetimes, almost like a unit. Like, these relationships stay with us, right? A web of karmic relationships. And if you pay attention, you will find that whenever the Buddha in a past life has a wife in a story, it's always her. And so he has these webs of relationships with his mother and his father and Devadatta and Ananda and all of these great characters that are in his life. He's also always connected to her. And I'd never really taken the time to think about that before, right? I was just like, oh, Jatakas, like, these are just fables, and I never took them too seriously. But if you stop and really think about it, you realize, hold on a second, this is telling us so much more about the tradition, right? It means that it's taking rebirth quite seriously, right? Even though I think in the West, often we want to throw that away because that invokes kind of religious beliefs that many people are uncomfortable with, but it's so endemic to the tradition. It gives you a sense of time being really long, right? So that the Buddha has been working on this for such a long time. This is not an instant karma situation. You don't say, oh, I want to become a Buddha, and then it happens. He wants to become a Buddha, and it takes him 100,000 lifetimes to get there. Right? And as he's working to get there, he's doing it with all of his family beside him, right? That they're all working with him. And so there's a sense of their exceptionality also, that if he's going to have somebody as his mother lifetime after lifetime, she has to be a special person to constantly have the honor of being connected to him, right? And so they're working together in their relationship as mother and son, and she's always his mother and he's always the son. The roles don't get reversed, right? And so the same with Yasodhara is that whenever we find her in Jataka stories, she's there as his wife. She doesn't take a different role. And so by the time they reach their final life, I've already figured out, so it's before I even get to their story. So much of what I needed to understand happens beneath the surface. It's like an iceberg, right? And so the story of the Buddha's life, his last life and his big adventure, that's the tip of the iceberg. But beneath that is this huge period of time where he's working towards awakening, and he does it with her beside him. And that to me doesn't seem negligible. If she's just some kind of like harem wife to like fit, like, okay, married, check, we're good, then that's not necessary, right? But she's as necessary as his biological mother, as his father, as Devadatta, who's always challenging him. All of these characters are necessary. She's necessary too. And I don't think I ever appreciated that until I sat down with the Jatakas and I thought, hold on, I think they're telling me the secret I wasn't listening to. She matters. So that's already the first part of like my thinking, but now I'm going to stop talking because that was a lot of talking and see if anybody wants to ask a question or say anything from that point. I haven't even gotten to their last life yet. That's just like the first part.
That's so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I've read, several, not many, many Jataka tales, and I never put it together until you pointed this out, that she's always his wife, and that the relationship is across lifetimes, bound across lifetimes. I'm curious, Khenmo, do you have questions or thoughts about this? Or if other folks do, they can raise their hands or write in the chat or just shout out.
It makes sense to me then. I never read all the footnotes to see how did Thich Nhat Hanh come up with his version of the story. But that's how, I can see. I just trusted him.
Yeah.
I can see that was the buildup that he could see and value. And, when we're seeing all of these stories, it's hard to know, seeing that some are hurtful, seeing that there's a tremendous controversy about changing the story, like the Theravadins don't accept Thich Nhat Hanh's version of the story, for instance. How, as a scholar, how do you feel responsible for evaluating the trustworthiness of the different sources that you can look to, in terms of, we can't change because we don't like what we're seeing as 21st century people, but how do you evaluate?
It's a really hard question. I think it depends on who you think your audience is, right? So, if I'm catering to a particular kind of fundamentalist group that has made decisions that these are the boundaries of the tradition, well, then obviously we're not going to be in an agreement, but I'm not trying to get to that agreement with them. As a scholar of the tradition and a historian of the literature, what I see is a library. I don't see one book or one set of books. I see Buddhism is so prolific, right? It's so exquisite. And wherever it goes, it starts again. So that, Buddhism starts in Northern India and it has Northern Indian stories that it's going to produce. Then it moves to Sri Lanka. And then you find these very specifically Sri Lankan materials that get added to the story. And the story gets told again, but now in Sinhalese. Then it moves to China and the stories become very Chinese and they're written in Chinese and the stories take on a new flavor. Then you go to Japan and Korea and it changes again, right? And so now it's in the West and it's changing again. But I feel like the notion that this is allowed and this isn't allowed has not been the trajectory of Buddhism. What I see in Buddhism is this kind of ongoing invitation to keep recreating the story, because that's what Buddhists have been doing for 2,500 years. But everywhere Buddhism goes, the tradition settles, it takes on the language and the culture of that place, and it becomes part of that place. Communities will create their own pilgrimage traditions. until the 19th century, Buddhists were not going to India to do a pilgrimage of the Buddha's life. They created it where they were. So you had Tibetan pilgrimage traditions and Japanese, right? And they were all local to those areas, right? So the idea that there's one way to do Buddhism and one story to tell and one book to read is, I think, contradicts everything that is its history. And that I think if there are communities that are trying to control that, I think they're welcome to do that. But as someone who reads the tradition the way I do, I see Buddhism as much more vast. And I see the tradition set up in a way that invites me to try again. I think that's what the tradition is doing. If you can tell the story in Chinese, why can't you tell the story in English? I don't see the difference. And if you can tell it in the 5th century, in the 7th century, in the 12th century, in the 15th century, in the 17th century, I have a book downstairs that I just got that I'm so excited about. It's a Judeo-Persian biography of the Buddha. So it's written in Judeo-Persian, which means it's written in Hebrew script, but Persian language, a biography of the Buddha from the 17th century. I mean, really. We've been like, Buddhists have been doing this in every language, everywhere in the world for 2,500 years.
So you intentionally chose to make it a novel. Do you feel that gave you the freedom to tell it in the way that you wanted to tell it without being tied to the limits of fragmentary sources?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you think a novel is versus a hagiography. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't even know where those boundaries are exactly. Because maybe like the early biographies or early hagiographies were their own kind of novel storytelling, right? So I didn't feel like it was so disconnected. It's just the modern shape of what the story is for me. But what I was very careful about is that at the end of the book, I spelled everything out. So that's something that the hagiographers didn't always do, although Tibetans like to do that, actually. In a lot of Tibetan texts, they'll actually tell you, they'll give you a verse, and then they'll tell you which text they got it from, and they'll actually build their text that way. So I did a little bit of that, is that at the end of my book, I break down every chapter and I say, in this chapter, this scene comes from this text, and this scene comes from that text, and this scene I made up because I needed to make a link. And so I walk the readers through how I built the story so they can see the map. And my map includes everything I had access to, right? Which is how I think the Chinese were telling their stories in the 1st century and the Japanese were telling their stories in the 8th century. Everyone used all the resources at their disposal. So as a scholar in the contemporary period, I have a lot more sources at my disposal. And so I map it all out at the end for people to be able to decide what they think of what I've done.
And I shouldn't say, I don't know that all Theravadins don't accept,
No.
But I certainly have run into some who can't entertain the idea of using a story from a later or unaccepted source. The significance, and I think you were describing your journey with the novel, the significance for me at looking at the women's stories is it gives women a pathway to enlightenment that fits their life experiences. Mm-hmm. And that I think is really important.
I agree. I think it's not just a path to enlightenment. I think it's a way of relating to women before even that path starts. So I think with the story of Yasodhara, what you have that's so moving is you have this sense of her being present for such a long time, and then taking rebirth in their final lives to then be abandoned, right? And so for me, the tragedy of her story is not just that he left her after being with her for thousands and thousands of lifetimes. So to me, this is kind of really profound heartbreak, right? That she could have this expectation that he was going to take her with him, right? That they've done this over and over and over again. They're moving towards this peak moment of his life together. And then at the last minute, after he marries her, and then I didn't tell you guys the early stories of their life together in their final life, but it's I mean, he fights for her. He looks for her. There's in one Sanskrit version of the story, the king wants him to get married because he doesn't look like he's super interested in getting married. And so he says, I didn't put this in the book, but it's a great scene. He says, okay, if you want me to get married, I'll accept. But here's the list of qualities that my wife has to have. If you can find this perfect woman, I'll marry her, but otherwise don't waste my time. And so the prince, the ministers of this kingdom, these poor guys are walking around with this list. And it's like the most impossible list of like, she has to be noble, she has to be beautiful, but she has to be bashful. She has to be sexy, but not too sexy. She has to know everything about sex, but she shouldn't show it, right? Like, it's just like this crazy list of all the things that she has to be able to do and to be. And they're walking around just like Cinderella's story, like, where is the slipper going to fit? And every house they go to, they cannot find this woman. And then finally they get to her house and they knock on the door and they show the list to her. And they said, the prince is looking for a woman like this. And they give her the list. And she looks at the list and she goes, well, that's me. Which is just amazing, right? She's not like, oh, I couldn't possibly meet those expectations. She says, no, that's me. There's no one else. I'm the one who's in that list. And then she says, you better marry me quick, because if you don't, I'm going to get stuck with an ordinary man, and I'm built to be with an extraordinary person. So she knows who she is. She knows she is Yasodhara. She knows that she is the only one in the universe who should be married to this man. And she tells them so. And so then he finds her, and then the father doesn't want her to marry him because he thinks the prince is like a spoiled brat. He grew up in his palace and never suffering. I don't know if this is a suitable candidate for my daughter. I mean, this is so wild. This is actually the story of the Buddha, whereas we're thinking, oh, anyone should be so happy and grateful to be married to the Buddha. And they're like, I don't know. I don't know if this is a good match. And so the father says, I'm not up for this. And you think the king is going to kill him. I don't understand how the king doesn't kill him. And he says, okay, let me talk to my son. He goes to see the Buddha, the future Buddha, the Bodhisattva. And he says, people are worried you don't know anything because you've been raised without any training. And he says, no problem. Let's do a competition. I'll compete in anything you want. And so they make this massive competition, right? And it's got everything from mathematics and debate to archery, to boxing, to cutting. I never understood what the cutting field was. Like, there's like the weirdest list of things. And the future Buddha competes in all of it, and he wins everything because he's obviously the future Buddha. So he proves that he's amazing. And finally, he can marry Yasodhara, right? And so you have this sense that he has pushed to get this bride. And so he finally marries her, and you think, yay, it's happily ever after. And they move into their beautiful palace, and they don't get pregnant for a very long time, which the texts don't really talk about. And then finally, while she's pregnant, he goes to see the four sights, right? And so finally, after his whole life of being shielded, of never seeing suffering, which is how the tradition sets it up, he goes out and he encounters old age, sickness, and death, just as she is giving birth to their child. And so you again have a sense that these are two majestic beings on very parallel paths. He's seeing suffering and she's suffering because she's giving birth, right? And so she has her body literally being ripped apart, and his mind is being blown open. And when he comes back from seeing the four sights, he's decided, I'm not going to stay. And he doesn't decide, I'll take her with me. He just decides to leave. And according to so many of the early sources, he goes to see her, and she's sleeping, and she's got her newborn son in her arms. This is actually one text in particular does it this way. And she's sleeping with her newborn son in her arms, and he stands on the threshold of her room, and he looks at her, and he doesn't step into the room. And then he thinks to himself, and the text says, the prince thinks to himself, if I go to touch my son, she will wake up, and then I won't be able to leave. Which to me tells me everything I need to know about my romantic tragedy that I've built in my head. That this is the most romantically devastating story that has ever been told. I don't know why we don't talk about Buddhism as the most romantic, right? I mean, think about it. Like, it's not just romantic in one life. This is many lifetimes of romance being shattered in this moment. It's devastating. And he turns around and he walks away. And she wakes up the next morning only to discover that her husband is gone. And so it's a path to awakening for her later. But right now, this is a story of a woman's sadness and of a woman's heartbreak, and the kind of heartbreak so many women have had to face. And that's what I find so interesting, is that here you have this religion that is so focused on monasticism and renunciation. And the writers stopped and took a moment to tell you what so many women experience in day-to-day life. And that blows my mind, that these writers took the time to tell us about an ordinary woman's experience with loss. Because the fact that they follow her and talk about what it's like for her the next morning means they're not following him. So the writers take a moment to not follow him, and they follow her in the palace. So it's like, if you think of it as a movie, the camera is supposed to be following him off into the forest, but they don't. They stay with her just a little bit, and you hear about her pain. And so you have these early ancient male writers talking about a woman's suffering, ordinary women suffering, being abandoned, being left behind with their son, not being brought on a journey, not being treated as an equal, even though she's been his equal and she knows it and he knows it. In this moment, he didn't take her as his equal. Right? It's a really powerful story, and it's devastating. And I'm obviously a helpless romantic, so I'm totally projecting all of that. Do with it what you want. But I feel like this is just, Julia Roberts needs to be in this movie.
I think this is the moment now to ask you to read one of your favorite parts.
I am seeing one hand though.
Sure.
Before, yeah, go ahead and ask your question. So,
yes, very, very interesting point of view. I love it. But I want to go back a little. I think there is a Hindu collection of stories called, it's the Ocean of Stories. But there is a section where they tell Jataka stories. And I believe there is a story there where Buddha is a woman. I was not looking at my shelf, but can't find the book right now. So if there is a link, I could send you if I can find it, or say something about it.
So you're right. There are a couple of later stories in which the Buddha becomes a woman in a past life. These are very unusual, and they happen in later sources. So in the earliest material that we have of Jataka stories, so like the Mahavastu and the Pali Canon, the early Sanskrit and the early Pali materials that we have, he's actually never a woman. And so we just get much, much later, every once in a while, these kind of odd hanging stories where he becomes a woman for a moment. And so it does exist, you're right. And remember, Buddhism is so prolific, right? There's so much. So everything is there, right? There's like no way to say this doesn't exist in Buddhist literature. Everything exists in Buddhist literature. And so this exists too. You're absolutely correct. But the early sources really don't place him in a woman's body. And it's systematic. So you have hundreds of stories, and he's always a male character, right? So that goes on for quite a long time. So those stories come much later, but you are correct that it does exist.
Yeah, I don't know the chronology, what time it is placed in this story. But I'll find out, because I have the book.
Okay, great. No, there's a couple of people that have worked on it, and I think some of the stuff is medieval. But not the earliest writings that we have tend to be between the 1st and the 5th century. And in those writings, we definitely don't have a woman.
Well, that in and of itself is interesting too, that for so long there were no Jatakas of the Buddha as a woman, but that then eventually some did start to come.
But it's not as though it comes in like a massive wave, right? It's like
right.
So like, the exception pops in. We're not quite sure how that happens, but it does happen.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm curious, are there other questions at this point or comments? I'm not seeing anyone's hand raised. So I'm wondering, yeah, Vanessa, this might be a great moment. Would you be willing to give us a brief reading?
Yes. So I can read you about a page and a half. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be great.
Maybe it's like closer to 2. I'm not sure. It's split on 2 pages. One place that works is kind of its own little nugget of a reading is right from the beginning of the book. The way I set up the book is that I tell the story of their romantic tragedy right through till the end. But at the beginning of the book, I tell one scene that comes later and then go back in time. And this is a scene that I had to make up because none of the early sources that I have come across actually tell this story. So many of the sources point to it that it must have happened, but nobody describes it. And so it was this very unusual opportunity for me to kind of create a scene that's part of the story, but that somehow the early writers never thought to describe. And I think they missed a golden opportunity. So this was also a really interesting thing to realize when you try to write the story, you realize what's missing and what's not in a way that I wasn't always conscious of until I tried to do it myself. And so the scene is that the Buddha leaves, the Bodhisattva leaves Yasodhara. She wakes up the next morning and she is devastated. And there's so many beautiful poems and pieces of literature in which they describe the sadness and the pain and the anger that she has when she wakes up the next day to discover that he's gone. And it's that lens that I was so fascinated by, that so many early writers took the time to tell us about her loss and were so sensitive to the suffering that she experienced as a woman losing her husband. And it almost sounds like it's familiar to these writers, right? Like as if they know what this is. They've seen it to their sisters, to their somebody, but they've seen this before. And so she has all of this range of emotion. And she even has this extraordinary moment where she attacks the chariot driver. And she says, "Where did you take him? How could you take him away from me? You let him go." And she said, and he says, "But I had no choice. He commanded me to go." And she said, "But didn't you tell him about me? Like, how could you let him go? He had me here." And so again, you hear that strength of character of her, that she knows she has value. On what grounds that he leaves? Like, how does he justify this? How does anyone, right? And there's another story in another text where she throws her arms around, I didn't put this in the book, but she throws her arms around the horse's neck, the great horse Kantaka, who galloped her beloved away. He comes back after galloping him away, just completely despondent because he wanted to follow his master into the forest, and the Buddha sends him back. And so poor Kantaka kind of walks back to the palace with his head down, and just like, and the text says that he comes home looking like he's coming to a funeral. And she sees him and she throws her arms around Kantaka and she sobs on his neck. I mean, it's do you see why I love this material? Like, how are we not telling this stuff? It's so tragic. And she's so mad, right? She's so mad. But finally, after a while, she settles down. Because what else are you going to do, right? Loss happens, you're furious, you're pissed off, you throw a few things, and then c'est fini. You have to just sit down and live with the loss, right? Because there's nothing else to do. And so she gets used to it. According to a number of traditions, she starts to wear white because she identifies as a widow, because she has no husband anymore, even though he's still alive. And she gets on with her life. And she lives in the palace and she raises her son in this palace with her in-laws, very isolating experience, alone with her son. And then, I mean, honestly, really, as husbands go,
well, this is, yeah.
He comes back, right? And so this is the scene that Venerable was talking about at the beginning. He comes back, right? And he's hail, the conquering hero, the great Buddha has returned. And the whole community launches themselves to go see him. They're so excited the Buddha has returned. And she's like, "Are you guys serious? Like he left me like a widow and you guys are all going to go jump at his feet? Like, do you know what he did to me? And so everyone goes to see him except her. And according to so many different versions of the story, she goes, and so everybody's in the courtyard and she goes to the window overlooking from the courtyard and she looks down and she thinks, I'm not going. And if he wants to see me, he's going to have to come find me himself. And of course he does, because she knows her husband. And so she refuses. And the only person that he makes the effort to go see personally is his wife. And so again, you get this feeling that there is such a connection between them, that this is not an ordinary relationship. And so he goes to see her. And so one of the scenes I had to invent is what that moment was like when they talked to each other, because the sources almost never tell us anything about that. The other scene I had to invent was the one that I want to read to you, is that after they talk to each other, however that goes, eventually she learns that her son has asked for his inheritance. So her son is about 8 years old now. So she has spent 8 years raising her son alone in the palace without a father, probably the only real close relationship she has in the world. And when the father comes home, the son goes to see the father and he asks, what about my inheritance? Right? Which is a tricky moment in the text. We're not quite sure what it means. And so the Buddha responds by saying, well, I'll shave your head and that's your inheritance, which I don't think is quite what the kid was thinking. And so instead of being made king, which maybe the little kid is hoping is going to happen, the inheritance that he receives is not going to be a golden throne, but it's going to be the throne of the forest. It's going to be the teachings. And so he's going to now, after he's visited the kingdom, he's going to leave again, and he's taking his son with him. So after all the loss that she has experienced, she finally settles down, and now her life is thrown into upheaval, and he takes his son away. Right? I have to tell you that just last week, I gave a talk to a Jewish community about this. It was the most fun I ever had telling this story, but everyone in the group had never heard anything of this. And this one woman, like an elderly woman, she just yelled into the camera. She said, this is the Buddha. She was so mad. I was like, oh no, what have I done? I've ruined Buddhism. She was like, I can't believe this is the story. I was like, no, it's a little bit the story. So now I'm going to read to you the scene that I had to imagine. And the scene that I don't see anywhere in the literature is the scene where she has to say goodbye to her son, which none of the sources tell us. Right? What was that moment like? How did she say goodbye? So the text opens with her in her room, sobbing to her maidservant and not knowing how to pull herself together. Right? So you have that sense of her private moment. But then she knows she has to say goodbye to her son or she'll lose access to even that moment. So she pulls herself together and she goes downstairs to find her child. I walked carefully down the round marble staircase that led to the great hall. My trembling had subsided, but I was still a bit uncertain. I held the golden handrail with one hand. I lifted my robes with the other so as not to slip. When I reached the bottom, I exhaled with relief. I could see bodies milling around in the courtyard, men dressed in orange rags moving silently, ochre-colored shadows. I adjusted my braid one more time, smoothed my white wrap and tightened my sash, and then crossed the great hall to the courtyard to find my son. He was sitting by himself by the edge of the lotus pool. How are you, darling? I asked as I sat down beside him. He didn't look up. His fingers were trailing through the water in between the flowers. A flock of blackbirds tore through the darkening sky, chasing the moon. He didn't notice them either. The servants would start lighting the oil lamp soon, and then everything would be different. Sweetheart? No response. Rahula, I whispered, as I placed my hand on the softness of his little neck. Please look at me. He trailed his fingers a little while longer, making pathways through the water. The frog watched him from the safety of a lotus leaf. Eventually, he looked up. His beautiful eyes were filled with the emotions he couldn't speak aloud. I wanted to fall into them. My mind fled into the past without permission as images of him from over the years paraded before my eyes. When had he grown so tall? I placed a lock of hair behind his ear as I'd done so many times before. But a moment later, I recoiled at the realization that soon his hair would be shaved away. He would be so different. He wouldn't be my son anymore. How are you feeling, sweetheart? I asked as I attempted to put those thoughts aside. He shrugged. I'm all right. Are you ready? I guess so. He turned to the water again. Sweetheart, it's all right to feel a bit scared. You don't have to be so brave. He looked up at me. You know, I added, I'm scared too. At these words, all of his restraint melted and he threw himself into my arms. Oh, mother, I am scared. I don't want to go. He sobbed against my neck. He was trembling, just as I had been a moment earlier. Every fiber in my being wanted to scoop him up and run away. Run from the men in orange robes who were forcing us into separation. Run from the world that dictated that such realities called them wisdom. My baby was crying. I wanted to make his tears go away. I inhaled the sweet smell of him. I would have renounced the whole world to be able to hold on to him longer. But I would not renounce his future to satisfy my desires. Slowly, ever so carefully, I pulled us apart. My most beautiful sweetheart, I whispered. I'm so sad. I can't imagine living without you. I wiped away the tears that were dripping down my own cheeks. But I won't hold you back. It's time for you to find your life. But I want to be with you. I know. I want that too, but you'll be with your father. He'll take good care of you. He looked past me to where the men were, his father sitting straight and elegant at the center. I don't even know him, he objected. You will learn to know him. Well, what if he doesn't like me? That, my darling, is one thing you don't have to worry about. You're impossible not to love, my beautiful Rahula, and your father is a good man, you'll see. He wiped his tears, which I knew was a good sign. What if I never see you again, mother? He asked. I believe we will see each other again. But if anything happens, I stumbled against the words, but then I caught myself. Well, then I'll see you in the next life. We'll never be lost to each other, Rahula. Don't ever forget that. Men in orange robes approached. Are you ready, young master? Asked one of them. Rahula searched my face, looking for permission. He is ready, I answered. That's the beginning.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for reading that to us. That was beautiful. That's such a moment of loss, and there are all of these beautiful moments of loss and letting go in this story. And I have to say, I was moved by it in a way that I haven't always been moved by this story before. And I think part of it is because you face that head on in your telling, in a way that in other versions it's like, yeah, and then he left.
Yeah.
And then we follow him on his journey, not what was that pain of him leaving actually like for those he left behind.
Well, the thing that is so familiar about it to me is that I feel like all major life decisions are like that. That we, like, there's no decision that you're going to make that's really, you're going to go down your own path, you're going to create loss.
Yeah.
And that's just how it goes. And what I think is so moving about this literature is that they let that be, right? They're not, so as much as Buddhism is so idealistic and you know, like kind of so shiny about everything and everything's perfect all the time, if you spend a bit more time with the literature, you realize it's actually much more sophisticated than that. It's much messier, right? This story of the Buddha's life is really messy. everybody's heartbroken, and the writers stay there. They don't wash it away and say, no, they were happy, everything was okay, and everybody lives happily. They do the happily ever after at the end, right? They fix everything at the end. But they spend a really significant portion of their writing showing you how much everybody lost, right? Everyone was so attached to him. Nobody wanted him to go. Even the gods that protect the palace, it said that after he left, the gods that protected the palace just reigned and reigned over the palace because they lost their prince. So that even the local gods were upset that he left, right? And so there's the tradition is showing you that no big decision is going to come without a price. And they make you stay there. And I think that, I don't know how we've been missing that part, right? That's the part that gives you the courage to make your life decisions. Because if the Buddha broke everybody's heart and it was okay in the end, I can make my life decisions too, right? Because he wasn't doing it to be selfish. He wasn't doing it to break everything. He was doing it because he had to do it. He had no choice. He was tied to these people forever, and he had to sever the ties. I mean, think of the courage of his story. Think of the loss for everyone else. Like, it's such a powerful story. So to reduce it to this kind of quick intro 101 Buddhism, there was a Buddha, he was a prince, he became we're killing the story, where all the teachings of the tradition are in this story. That's all you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I'm seeing a hand.
But before we go to that, I think that's the point of the stories, is that human life is filled with this heartbreak.
Yeah.
When we look at the Therigatha and the stories of, the nuns who lost children and lost parents and were driven mad by the loss, and then found their sanity again through an understanding of practice. So on the one hand, we can't avoid it, but when I think of how is this story useful, it's because he could see that this was, after all of those lifetimes, the one moment where suffering could be changed for the people he loved and for everyone else. So if I were to only focus on the rage of the abandonment, I wouldn't be able to keep, in any way, how would that story be useful? We all know what that rage is like and what that heartbreak is like. I think I had some friends who were giving birth at home, and I went to visit them, an hour or two after the birth, and I could just see in the couple that either one of them, if they knew they had one opportunity to save the people they loved from future suffering, even if it was painful, they would do it just out of sheer love. I think we have to find that part of the story as well. But you're right, we've made it into a few sentences and lost the power of it.
So that was a big part of my wrestling with the story, is that I knew that if I was going to write the story, I had to get to the point where I loved him again, and I couldn't be mad at him. I knew that I was struggling with, how could he do that? Right? That's where I was stuck. And so every time I would go to this story, I'd be like, how could this be the story of the Buddha? Like if you interview the wife, it's not a good story, right? And so I was stuck with that. And every time I was I rewrote this book so many times because I knew I had to get to a point where he was beautiful. And he had to be beautiful to me to be able to write him as beautiful. I couldn't bullshit it. He had to be beautiful to me. And so that's when I knew I was doing the journey with them. I had to show the mess and the heartbreak, and I had to go there. But it felt like the only way I was going to get to the end of the book was to know that he's beautiful too. And then it was okay. because I thought this is the mess of life, that it was so important that he goes. He couldn't not go. And it was so important to know that he hurt everybody too. Like both of those things are true at the same time, right? It wasn't, he did this, therefore he's awful, and that's the end of the story. We're going to have some angry vision of the story. Like it wasn't, I didn't want that, right? I knew I didn't want that for my own way of writing the book. I just had to get there for him to be beautiful and for her to be heartbroken. And they had to both be true, you know?
And her heartbreak is finally healed when she joins the Sangha, when she joins the women who are leaving. And that for me, I mean, at the very end is incredibly powerful, because it seems like the first moment where she actually is empowered and is sort of living in a way that she hadn't since he had left.
Yeah.
Which was a huge relief after all of her suffering. Is it okay if we have a couple hands up?
Yes.
Could I call on folks? So David.
Hi all. So I teach with Professor Melnick at Bates. I teach Buddhist philosophy. I'm in the philosophy department. And I'm just loving this so much. I can't wait to read your book.
Oh.
I'm really glad you read that passage, and just the insights from the three of you have just been so wonderful. I really appreciate like you're focusing on the relationships in this way and bringing them out. I raised my question, I raised my hand because one of the difficult questions I have with my students is often how Buddhism involves the severing of relationship, doesn't appreciate relationships, doesn't appreciate connections. And I'll often talk about how the Dalai Lama and others will focus on, you know, think of everyone as your mother. Like, obviously that's the model of love and connection. It's expanding that love that you have for family and those closest to you, to everyone is, you know, the ideal. So, but I'm really curious, as someone who's focused so much on, you know, the depth of personal connection in the stories going back through thousands of lifetimes. I mean, it's just incredible the way you portray it. And this element of Buddhism that is like, okay, but liberation involves breaking those ties of family and expanding so that they aren't defining you. The near enemy of partial attachment isn't defining you, but you have equanimity and love for everyone. And that aspect of teaching, of the teachings and of teaching the teachings, I'm curious your thoughts on, all three of you, your kind of thoughts on that, but in your connection, writing the novel in particular, how do you feel like the ultimate message is, but we have to break those connections, or that those connections are deep and defining? The way you talk about the Buddha going back, and the one person he goes back and sees is her, means that those connections kind of are nonetheless still special despite the expansion of love. So I'm curious where you stand on that, what you think of that. But thank you so much. I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, I'm so glad. I feel like I love Bates and I need to be at Bates.
Yes, come to
I feel like it's a bit, so at the beginning I was talking about my impression that there's this kind of tug of war that's happening in the literature all the time. I think I would answer it again as a tug of war. I think that there are moments where the connections are severed, right? He has to go, right? And he's not taking anyone with him. And I think that's important to identify, because if you look at Indian storytelling, there are lots of examples where sages or hermits or whatever take their wives with them. So if we put it in its kind of like storytelling context, he could have taken her with her. Like it's a conceivable argument. And we even have Jatakas where they go off together. So he really could have taken her with her and he would have still been a sage and achieved great heights of whatever. So I think the fact that he doesn't is that severing of the connection. On the flip side, there's all these moments where you feel as though the connections are still recognized. It's not as though everyone, I think students struggle with this a lot, of like this idea that once you achieve awakening, it's like you don't see people or something, right? It's like something happens to your brain fizzes out and there's no sense that anyone ever birthed you, right? Or that this random person over here was your mother at some point, but it doesn't matter anymore. I think these understandings are way too extreme. I can see how we get to them, but I don't think they're helpful. I don't know anyone who operates that way. right? I mean, even the Dalai Lama, if we want to use him as an example, he still identifies as family members and he still takes care of them and he keeps them close to him. It's not as though he severed his relationships with them. When the Buddha's, when Gautami is ready to go for her final enlightenment, sorry, I keep moving things around because I want to see your face as I talk to you, but you keep jumping around in my screen. So I'm looking for your face again. Oh, there you are again. Okay, hi, David. So in the Apadana verses, which are these verses of her kind of great accomplishment at the end of her life, just before she kind of flies off into final nirvana, the Buddha recognizes her as his mother. He says, my mother is going to die. And then he is there to carry the bier with Ananda and Devadatta, right? Like there's a sense of family obligation, not Devadatta, but there's a sense of family obligation to her. So people are still in relationship with each other. And I think we have to not go too far into extremes in our understanding that, yes, there's a kind of severing of the hold, but not a severing of a recognition that these people are in your life, right? So I think it's much more nuanced than I think we often, I don't know if that's helpful, but I do think it goes back and forth.
It is so helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, and I think it makes a really important point that sometimes we see our families as an extension of ourselves. So that sense of having to protect and defend sets up a tribalism, and Buddhism isn't trying to sever familial relationships. They're trying to use it as a leaping, if you can understand how to love one person, one child, then love all children.
Right. But it doesn't mean you don't love your child anymore.
No.
And it doesn't mean that you don't know that's your child. I think that's where people imagine it's like you don't even see that that's your child, and that it's like we do something really wonky in our understanding with that. But his whole family is with him all the time, right? There, the whole sangha is really his family, right? Those are the first people who are going to join him. I mean, Ananda was with him for lifetimes and is with him in his final life. And I mean, Ananda is not a great example because he gets too attached, but it's his family that is with him. He surrounds himself with that.
Thank you. Jane.
Yeah, this has me remembering back when I was part of a Zen community for 7 years, a long time ago. There seemed to be this tension between the folks who would focus more deeply on practice and the folks who had families and had kids and were very serious practitioners, but were also being realistic about, what they were doing in their lives. And so it's not a question, it's just more of a comment. I think that tension and the tendency for some people to view one as better than the other, when in fact, people who can really penetrate Buddhism and take that into their everyday lives are unbelievably important, especially in the current world. We need more of that spread at every level. And so I think, forgetting is one better than the other, and just saying we each find our calling and do that. And wherever we're doing it, it's needed.
I think that's really wise. I think what you're saying is very true to the moment of where we live and how we live. I would just challenge it a little bit, that even though I think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense for this moment, again, I'm like part of, I'm not specialized in the Zen tradition. It's got a very different focus in the Zen tradition. But in the early Indian texts, I think there is still a kind of celebration of renunciation that I wouldn't bypass. I wouldn't make everything equivalent. Renunciation in monasticism is still celebrated as a kind of ideal. It gets challenged, it gets criticized, it gets pushed, and a lot of demands are made on it. So it's not an easy relationship with monasticism, but I do think that there is a sense that the monasticism has a higher place, that there is for the few that can do it, and there's an understanding that only few can do it, right? That it is not there for all of us to participate in. That it is like so difficult to find the right words to say this, but in some ways, I do think it's a higher practice, or ideally, right? Again, it gets challenged, it gets pushed back, it gets criticized all the time, right? And then you get too attached to the hierarchy and you take yourself too seriously, and then you get Vimalakirti, who takes that all down. But I do think there's a place in which we have to understand that monasticism does have a particular role to play in the Buddhist imagination that we should be challenged by, and not make everything equal too quickly. Do you understand what I'm, so I think you're right. I think we all have to find our place, but I wouldn't want to water down the role that monasticism plays in traditional Buddhist imagination.
I guess the one thing that makes me think about is looking in the Catholic tradition, and I'm not as deeply familiar with back farther than our current times in the Buddhist tradition, but so many of the monastics end up going astray and having rationalizations, apparently, or either they can't deal with it and so they don't think about that they've gone astray, or they have rationalizations for why it's okay. So I have a lot of mixed feelings about that.
It has to do with understanding renunciation, not whether you're lay or monastic. It has to do with understanding renunciation. And we understand the pointing out that monastics take on as karma made visible. And so whether we're lay or monastic, if karma is being made visible, and by keeping your life clear and really understanding renunciation of letting go so that your karma is continually getting clearer, then that's a more, I think, sophisticated understanding. I saw a hand up of Carol Bailey.
There was Sue had her hand up a little bit earlier, so I was going to call on her and then Carol next. Sorry. Go ahead, Sue.
Well, first of all, what a wonderful evening. Thank you. Khenmo, I want to hear your talk on renunciation. But I wanted to ask if any of you are familiar with, I think it's Janet Suri is the author of there's a book about the Buddha's wife, and I started it. I haven't finished it, but the premise was very much like he who goes forth and she who stays behind, and it's about awakening in community, which I think is a very interesting, and it feels like a more feminine the way women do, and it also has me thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh reading that he said the next Buddha will be the Sangha. So there's something that feels really important about Sangha and community right now. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that, if you're familiar, any of you, with her book and what you might say. It's inspiring to see women coming forward. My friend Pam Weiss is doing this, and I think you know Pam, Vanessa.
I do, yeah.
I told her about tonight. Coming forward with these stories and finding ways to think more deeply and bring forth the stories of women and what it might have been like, because I guess that's all we can do.
I think it's really exciting that we're seeing more people write about Yasodhara and write about the women in the Buddha's life. So I think all of this is great. I do know Jan Suri's book, and I've met her and we've discussed it. She's a psychotherapist, I think, or she's somewhere in the clinical psychology. I don't have the right term, but her and her husband have a joint kind of practice, and they wrote the book together, and their concern is about family life within Buddhism. And so in that context, it's very beautiful what she's done with the book. The obstacle that she had is she didn't know the stories very well. So she just had kind of so this is, I don't want to, there's a limit to what I want to say here, but I think what she was trying to do theoretically was really lovely, but unfortunately she didn't have that much familiarity with the story. So she just had the story that he left her. And from there, she created a story. So that it's too bad that she didn't have access to more of the material. But I think it's very exciting that people are talking about this and trying to find new languages and ways to tell these stories. So yeah, I think it's great.
So it doesn't have the underpinnings
It's
from all the texts and all the research.
no.
I had a sense there was a real agenda in terms of trying to share a practice around community.
Yeah, I think that's much more what she's interested in. She's not a textual scholar. She doesn't know these stories in this way. So she's got a very different thing that she wants to accomplish with her book.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to reading your book.
Thanks.
Thank you. Carol.
Yes, I'm looking forward to reading your book as well. And I just find the passage that you filled in with extraordinary on a lot of levels. I mean, at one moment I felt as though it was not the Yasodhara talking to her son, but at one moment I felt as though it was the Buddha thinking of what he was doing as he left. I mean, there's a kind of parallel, it seems, in those two places where it's really quite extraordinary. That little piece that you've dropped in there almost makes a parenthesis over the suffering of both of them, because I feel like if they followed each other through all of those lifetimes, they kind of had a deal. And the deal was, when you get to this point, we're gonna, whichever way it falls, I'll do my part by staying behind, and you do your part by moving forward. And by having the son, I actually asked Khenmo about this, or maybe I asked Alison when we last spoke, what happened to Yasodhara? Was she dumped out of the palace? But the son allowed her to stay in the palace. So she was set up to be able to stay without losing even more. But that piece that you wrote really made that a whole thing in my mind. And I'm so excited to read the entire thing. I'm also so excited to hear about the Chakatra stories and to have a little bit more historical reference to the ways the stories were told, that the beauty of Buddhism is that it allows for all human beings in whatever culture they come through to be a part of it, I guess. And that's wonderful. I really appreciate what you're talking about. And of course, I love stories.
Well, there's so many great stories. And I think once you start kind of playing around with them, it's really hard to not read them. And there's so much to explore. So I wish you luck as you start diving into this material, and you'll see all kinds of things that I won't see, that, like each of us will see different things in it. So it's very exciting.
I asked one of the geshes in Dharamsala once why Buddha was a man. And it was really interesting, because if we look at, culture of this human culture in this world, he said it was because Buddha had to demonstrate that there was no earthly happiness that could truly make you, in an unchanging, peacefully happy. And that he had to be a demonstration of the highest privilege. And that if it was a culture where women had the highest privilege, then a woman would be the Buddha, because you had to leave, there couldn't be any ifs. Well, if he had a more beautiful wife, or if he had this or he had that, then he wouldn't have left.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, there's verses in these texts that say that the reason that he had to have Rahula born is so he can go. Right now, he really has everything. He has the perfect palace. He has the throne that's waiting for him. He has the perfect wife. He even has progeny. So there's no missing piece. And so it's only when Rahula is born that he's finally free to go, because then he's doing the ultimate renunciation, because he's renouncing it all.
Well, he's free to go, and then he's demonstrating for all time that all of this can't really make you happy.
Right. Yeah. Which is just heartbreaking.
Indeed. Tita, I see your hand.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Vanessa, for this really interesting talk. And thank you, Khenmo, for making it happen. And thank you, Alison, for creating this forum. I have two questions to anybody. One is these sources that are getting referenced, are these people who actually were in the Buddha's presence during all of the times that they are writing about, embedded in his life?
No, I wish. We don't even have any material evidence from the Buddha's lifetime. So historically, we're really kind of in a no man's land. We don't have archaeological evidence from his time period. We don't have writings from his time period. So we really, a lot of this is our imaginings and our hopes and our aspirations, but not necessarily anything that is verifiable. We certainly have no data. The beginnings of our writings are about the first centuries, the earliest writings that we think, and we don't have manuscripts from the first century. We have writings that we think we can date to the first century. And so most of our early writings that I keep referencing is about 1st to 5th is what we consider to be the early body of literature that Buddhism produced. And it's it's 500-600 years after the Buddha lived, if he lived in the time and place as we think he did. So there's a lot of potential broken telephone. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of murkiness. So if you want to be really strict as a historian, we've got a lot of gaps.
Thank you. And it sounds like the narrative being created is that his journey, like she was left behind, implying that her journey was lesser than his journey, that his was in solitude and hers was in community, and somehow the narrative seems to keep playing out that her journey to enlightenment is, I'm just hearing that a lot.
Well, his journey is more important than everybody's, right? I mean, he's the Buddha. So I think he's just in a category, and that's like really clear from the sources as well. He is the Buddha. He is this one being who is going to set the wheel of Dharma in motion that no one else can do, only a Buddha can do. And so there is, and again, I'm not saying any of this is being true, but what I think the tradition is painting is a picture of this one spectacular being who somehow made it to this point where no one else was at this point. And so when he achieves awakening, the whole universe, and so here again, your storytelling is really quite amazing. Like the cosmos shakes and it trembles, and the gods are applauding in the sky, and there's like flowers that are the size of like your entire body that are falling on the ground. I mean, this is a majestic cosmic moment. It's not just one guy figures it out. It's a cosmic moment of cosmic importance that the cosmos has been waiting for thousands of years, right? And so his journey is of a particular primacy in the Buddhist imagination, and to say otherwise, I think, is really not to be paying attention to the literature. But there have been thousands of Buddhas before him, and there will be thousands of Buddhas after. And so again, this tug of war that I talked about, you see it all the time. So the tradition is going to tell you that this one being is spectacular, but at the same time, there's exactly the same kind of being coming in a few thousand years, that the universe cycles with Buddhas, right? And then those great majestic beings that are these Buddhas who achieved perfect awakening and changed the cosmos for all of us for all time, had families that were really important to them and didn't do it on their own. And so it's this kind of back and forth that is always happening of he is spectacular, but he is in community, and he is unique, and yet he's exactly like all the other Buddhas that came before him. And so you never get quite one answer. The tradition is kind of pulsating all of these truths at the same time, and you have to kind of get used to the rhythm of it instead of just, this is the answer. This is the answer, and that's the answer. And oh no, but this is also the answer, and now we're back to that answer. And you have to kind of get comfortable in that, if that helps.
Thank you.
So I have a question that I'll throw out there, and I'm curious to know if other people have questions that they would like to ask. But so I study hagiography. I study Tibetan hagiography. So hagiography, for those who don't know, it's the life of this saint. It's a life story of the saint. And I'm curious, in your introduction, you talk about historical fiction, and then you talk about how in your mind, this book is more almost potentially hagiographic fiction. And I would love to hear more about that approach and how you sort of went about thinking about creating this beautiful piece of work.
I'm so struck. I wrote that line because I was trying to get at what I was trying to say, and I wrote it spontaneously. And I wrote hagiographical because I couldn't figure out how else to say it. So I just said, I'll call it this. And I put quotation marks around it. I thought, oh, to hell with it. That's what I'm calling it. And it was this kind of moment, spontaneous decision to just do it and move on because I was so stuck. And I don't think any line I've ever written has ever received as much attention as that one line. I get it quoted back to me constantly all the time. So I'm glad it's quoted back in an okay way because it was a real spontaneous move. But it was trying to figure out what is this process, right? And I kind of felt like what I was doing was a continuation of what the hagiographers were doing before me, right? And it sounds right. I mean, some of these hagiographers were extraordinary writers, so I don't want to put myself in the same camp as them artistically. I'm never going to get close to Ashwagosha, and I can never even write like this. It's not a comparison. And this was the first novel I ever wrote, so I don't think I'm up there with Shakespeare or anything like that. But I was trying to voice the story that meant something to me. And the more I was doing it, the more I felt like I'm pretty sure that's what they were trying to do. And so I did feel sometimes like I was in a lineage with them, even if I'm not of the same caliber, that I was trying to participate in this story that I don't think is historically true because I'm writing it. So it's not true. It's my imagination of it based on all these stories that are all contradicting each other, that were written hundreds of years before the event, right? Like, this isn't about historical truth. It's a story. And it's a story of not one saint, but in my head, many sacred persons that are struggling through their journey. And by participating in writing their story, I felt like I was participating in a tradition that was 2,500 years old, right? That I was struggling with trying to articulate, how do I see the story the way Ashwagosha did 2,000 years ago, the way Thich Nhat Hanh did like 30 years ago, right? Like I felt like I was in a lineage with all these people who were just trying to tell the story. And so we have a category of historical fiction. This isn't historical fiction because I don't think it's historical, but it's hagiographical, right? So maybe it's a hagiographical lineage that I'm jumping the train into, or it's hagiographical fiction. I'm not quite sure what this is, but it does feel familiar. And I do feel like I'm participating in something that many people before me did.
You know, it's just that it's not finished because you haven't gotten to her enlightenment.
Well, so that's no, but you see, I can't write that story. So when I finished this book, I stopped with them leaving for the forest. And I thought, that's it. I can't go further than that. Like I can't follow them in the forest. I'm not qualified. And so I just stopped with, they go to sorry, it's a spoiler alert, but it stops there. But I had to stop there because I didn't think I was allowed. I felt like this is sacred space to go in. Like I can do the householder part. I am a householder. So I can write that part, but I can't go into the forest because that's where they start asking for something I've never asked for. And so again, to kind of go back to, I think it was Jane and her question of renunciation, because I'm so entrenched in the early literature where monasticism as a form of renunciation is viewed as higher, I'm so used to that language. For me, monasticism is a kind of higher state. Even though I agree with Venerable of this idea that renunciation is a state of mind, it's not the robes you wear, and I can understand the argument, I'm still very classical. And so I'm used to this understanding. And so I didn't think I was allowed in. And I wrestled with that for a long time as to whether or not I can write the next part of the story because I'm not part of that story. And I had a number of conversations with monastic friends and they said, no, we want you to come. Like, please come to the forest and write the story. And so but I still can't write her awakening. So I'm writing the next part, and it's about their request for ordination. It's not about their awakening. That I don't think I'll ever write that story.
Well, the thing that where I'm tied to your description of loss is the story of, I think it's Patakara, who lost her children and became the nun who welcomed women who had gone through great loss. And so
she's in the new book.
Conquering that was her path to enlightenment, and then she helped others.
Yeah.
And so it's missing to stop.
No, I know. So I'm doing but what I'm doing is a totally different voice. The second book is following somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
It's very inspired by the Therigatha, obviously, and the character that I've chosen to follow into the forest is a nun from the Therigatha. Her name is Vimala, and she's a very minor character. So I needed somebody who didn't have a big story, so I had room to play instead of a character like Patachara who would take up, like I have to follow her too much.
Mm-hmm.
So Vimala's story is that she was a prostitute. And she's from Vesali, which is where they ask for ordination. So that kind of gave me, that's who I decided to follow. And so I've created a whole life for Vimala based on my understanding of life of prostitutes in ancient India. I did a lot of research on that to kind of create this character. And she meets Patachara, and she meets Mahapajapati Gautami, and she meets all of these big characters, but she's not one herself. And so she gets to watch these characters as they're leading the way, and she's kind of reticent, kind of like I felt. Do I go in the forest? Do I not go in the forest? So she's kind of my reticence, but she goes in the forest.
To me, this is another one of the astounding stories that haven't been told, because there is Mahaprajapati next to her. You know, the hierarchy in a monastery is the day of your ordination. So you're all of a sudden class and caste is set aside, and the women are given authority to run their own community. So that is a big story in that era.
Well, one of the titles that I played with, but I didn't call it, but I'm terrible at titles. So it's always the last thing I write. But for a while, I wanted to call it Queens and Prostitutes, but that wasn't right. But it was that feeling of queens and prostitutes together.
Yes.
And there's such a sense of community in this early literature of these women walking away together and walking together to ask the institution, which is basically what this is, right? It felt like a women's march. And so I feel like these women are coming from all over. Some are prostitutes, some are homeless, some are widows, some are queens, some are princesses, and they all join ranks. It's another story that just blows my mind. And they just walked together and said, let's ask the Buddha if he'll give us permission as a group. They didn't like have the queens in the front and the prostitutes in the, they just went as a group of women. And what's so moving is that this Therigatha, this text that Venerable just made reference to, is the only piece of early literature that we have in the world of any religion that I know of that is the voices of women from about 2,000 years ago. It's 73 poems, and it looks like it really was authored by women, that this would not be a men's text. And each poem is a poem of accomplishment, so that every woman in this book has achieved awakening. So it's a collection of accomplished women, but you have a sense of their hardship, so that each woman tells you her story. So like Patachara, who lost her children and lost her husband and lost her parents and goes mad with grief until she figures it out. And you have Bara Kundalakesa, who's another one of my favorites, who was a Jain nun who was wandering around as a nun in another order, and she would debate everyone, right? So everywhere she went, she would sit down and she would debate whoever was teaching, and she would win the debate. And she was like, just nobody's smart enough for me. And so she's annoyed and so she's like, 100 years old by the time she discovers the Buddha. And she's like, now we've got it, right? Like there's all these fascinating characters with different histories. And then you have the queen, Mahapajapati, who's there. You have her daughter, the princess, who goes because she was bored and nobody else was in the palace anymore. So she just like, I'll just go. Right? The Therigatha says that, like everybody left, so I went. Right? Like it's this fascinating collection of women with all different motivations. They're not all pure motivations, but they all get there. Like, what a story. And then, now see, I struggle. The Buddha goes, I don't know if I should give you ordination. I don't think so.
Now, see, I do not buy that.
I'm so glad, but that's what the literature says.
No, because the other, contemporary scholars have said an equally valid telling of the story is he gave them ordination, but he wouldn't let them wander the streets and sleep alone and sleep outside. I do not buy that it goes with enlightenment that he said no 3 times.
Okay, but then he also gives you the Garudharmas.
I'm not sure that is a later imposition or not. It's
of course it's later.
On that. Yeah.
Of course it's later, but it doesn't matter. That's the story that we tell. Is it right? So that's when we get stuck. We're like, is this historical? Is it not? But at the end of the day, these are the stories that we are left with, and what do they mean?
Well, yes, and now we live in an era where we can evaluate the stories and say, all right, if this is a cultural imposition that's so much later and clearly, not from the time of the Buddha, why are we still telling the story? Because the other part of the, saying no to ordination is not only am I saying no 3 times, but you're going to set the Dharma back 500 years. It will end early. It's like, no, I'm, especially.
I have to read my book.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't tell that story to anybody.
Yeah, I know the 500 years and that you're like mold on a rice field. That one just about kills. That one's just a knife to the heart every single time. But I have to wrestle with it. I'm never going to go to sleep. I swear, I have to figure out this story.
Well, you could figure out the much couple 100-year later person who couldn't bear that women could run their own community.
I'm going to imagine a monk going, I'm going to add this now and make women suffer for all time. Yeah, it's a tough story to write. I'm still stuck with it. I'm not done yet.
Okay.
But the Garudharmas are in the story.
Yep.
I'm sorry. It's a tough one.
Thank you both so much for talking about all of this and giving us so much to think about. I'm wondering if anyone who has been listening has thoughts that have come up that they're thinking about, that they're wondering about, that they'd like to discuss. If you do, just use the hand raise function to raise your hand and we can call on you. I'm not seeing anyone. All right, let's see. No. Okay, cool. Well, it might be that our conversation has come to its natural end, which is great. I want to say on behalf of Vajra Dakini Nunnery, thank you all for coming. Vajra Dakini is run completely on dana. And for those of you who don't know the word dana, this is gratitude or offerings from the Sangha. So if you feel moved to give a donation as thanks or gratitude, you can do that through this website that I just dropped in the chat. But I wanted to say to both Khenmo and to Vanessa, thank you for coming and sharing with us your wisdom and your ideas and your humor. And thank you to the audience for coming and participating.
Thank you so much.
Vanessa, thank you so much. And your book was a joy to read, and it really just gave a breath of life to the
so many tears
story of Yasodhara, and now you have me thinking about her story in a totally different way. So really,
it's been such a pleasure talking to a person. It's been really lovely getting to know you. So I hope this is the beginning of friendships and new opportunities in the future to be together. Really, really. And I'm sorry I didn't get to see all of you in person too. I wish we can be in person and be in a room and, kind of have tea together and laugh a bit more. But the little bit of faces I got to catch on the side have been lovely, and it was nice to see all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, thank you for your book. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. I cried like 6 times. It's very
Really,
romantic
thank
in a
you
good
for
way.
the
It was a good-
research, yes.
Yeah.
You know, that, you know, opening up the story and recognizing that there is freedom to really look at all the different stories and really find the meaning, you know, for each person. You know, we each relate to a different part of the story.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Good night, everyone. I'm going to end the recording. Good night.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to debate with you when I finish this other book.
Let's do a quick dedication. Bodhicitta,
Yes.
excellent and precious mind, where it is unborn may it arise, where it is born may it not decline, but ever increase higher and higher. Well, I wish all the monasteries were having this you know, discussion more about Buddha's mother and really taking this holiday with a different perspective. That would be fun.
It'd be nice. It was nice to do tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you so much, and good
Vanessa,
night.
Alison, and Khenmo.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Wonderful. So wonderful.
Sweet dreams.
You too.